I grew up with my sister, living in a large house along with my mother and father. It was a big house, but was such fun to run around in with just me and my sister. We did everything together. We'd watch TV or just sit around with coloring books, build stuff with blocks, and sometimes even have her read stories to me. She would always be the last to leave my room at night, and the first to be by my bedside when I would wake up. We were inseparable every day. I couldn't imagine life without her at that time. Even when I would go to school, she would always be the first person I'd run to just to talk about my day and all the activities I did. She would always listen to my every word. She kept me out of trouble and sometimes would be the trouble to pull little pranks on our parents. One day I woke up and I was kind of stunned to find she wasn't there to say, "Good morning, Bug," like how she would always do. But that morning was different. I went to my parents asking where Katie was, and all they would say was, "I don't know, sweetie," which I found really odd. I started to feel scared for whatever reason, 'cause she wasn't there, and I acted out in crying fits, asking for Katie. "Where Katie? I want Katie." When nighttime came around, she wasn't there to put me to sleep, and of course I acted out again and again. This went on for weeks until it was time my parents would take me to a child psychologist. I kept asking about Katie, no matter who I talked to, 'cause she was my world and my everything. She was my safety. But it turns out Katie didn't exist at all. But I knew she was real, no matter how much they tried to convince me she wasn't. I thought back to all the times me and Katie played, watched TV, colored in my books, and even read stories at night in my bed. All those times I asked my parents about Katie. That whole time they thought I was just making up an imaginary friend, and played along with it whenever I would mention or acknowledge her. But they were just doing so to keep my imagination sharp. They had started to suspect I was developing a type of schizophrenia, hence why the child psychologist was an option. For years, I seen this psychologist and told him about Katie and how she looked, talked, her age, and all the basics, but over time, I somehow grown to accept that she was just make-believe, like they said she was. Then I got older. I eventually grew out of the phase and forgot about Katie altogether, up until I became an adult. One afternoon, I was sorting through old junk in my parents' house when I came across an old drawing of me and Katie that I had made. We were holding hands and reading a book, it looked, and all these memories came flooding back. I remembered Katie, and I felt a sense of comfort overwhelm me as I sat down looking at that drawing in the garage. And that's when I started to realize something. I took out my phone and looked up some old town records along with the address of the house I grew up in. It turns out that 10 years before we had moved into this house was another house that burned down. A mother and her 2 kids made it out safely, but one child didn't. 9-year-old Katie died in the fire, trapped in her own room. I remember always wondering why Katie's face was pale and red on one side of her face. Hair stringy and wet, but never questioned out loud because I was naive and thought that's just how she was because she was always around me for as long as I can remember. I wasn't schizophrenic, wasn't delusional or crazy, none of those things they said I was. She wasn't even an imaginary friend of mine that I just made up. Katie was a ghost, who I thought was my sister that whole time. There are days when I go to visit my mother since my dad passed. I'll be alone, walking down those long hallways, and I'll feel a little hand holding mine. I'd stop and close my eyes and whisper, "Hello, sister." And we'd walk into a room, and just like that, she'd be gone. I like to think she's watching over my mother when I'm not around. It brings a comfort to know that Katie still cares and is still there.